Hello, we're Lilith and Lara here with Coffee, Cakes, and Castles, where we will be covering the 20,000 to 25,000 castles of Germany. We'll be talking about historical facts, myths, legends, and drama.
And today we're diving into a city filled with a rich history that has everything from a murder to a peasant revolt to what might be the most stunning example of Baroque architecture. So, this is Würzburg for you today.
Hi, I'm Lilith. I'm from America.
And I'm Lara from Germany. And we're just two girls who happen to love all things involved coffee, cakes, and castles, especially when you can have coffee and cake inside a castle. And today we're diving into the drama, intrigue, and medieval peasant revolt. We are moving to Würzburg of the Lower Franconia region of Bavaria, an area which is filled with a long and fascinating history, wine, and Baroque beauty.
And I have to say that this episode really brings it with the drama, the intrigue, and once again, murder. Hmm. Starting with some general information. So being short on time was kind of the theme of our trip, but it's how we got to visit so many really cool places. And we did not get to tour the Marienberg Fortress or the Würzburg Residence, but we did stop for lunch adjacent to the residence. And we did kind of peek inside through the windows, and we wished that we had time to tour it, but we did not. For those that do have the time and would like to visit, currently, tickets are cash only at the desk, and they're 10 euros regular and 9 reduced. And of course, always check the website for the most updated information. They do have guided tours and self-guided tours. The church and the court garden are free to walk around, and children under 18 are free. There's a dedicated residence parking lot and surrounding parking garages. And then to visit the Marienberg Fortress, it's a steep walk, but doable, and it gives a panoramic view of the city. The interior of the fortress is currently under construction, so only the outer grounds are currently accessible to visitors, which are free to walk around. So just once again, check the website for updates on that. And then a quick tip for anybody planning to visit Würzburg. It's also famous for its wine festivals, and the gardens are especially beautiful to see in spring.
Yes. And now, before we dive into Würzburg, let's talk about the differences between a castle, fortress, and a palace, because we will be talking about 2 out of 3 today. And yeah, a castle is both defensive and residential. It's built to protect, but it also serves as the private home of a lord or noble. And castles typically feature towers, curtain walls, moats, and gatehouses. But inside, you'll find great halls, chapels, kitchens, and chambers for daily lives. They were symbols of feudal power, often placed on hills or river crossings to control the territory. And a fortress is different. It's military in purpose, stronghold designed for war. And you think of massive stone walls, bastions, ramparts, and complex defensive systems, which are on the fortress. They rarely emphasized with comfort. They were about survival and strategy. And yes, a castle can also function as a fortress when heavily fortified. And a palace was about comfort and ceremony. Palaces usually lack serious defensive structures, and if they do have defensive structures, they're more often than not for decoration. They are residences for monarchs or aristocrats designed to impress with architecture, gardens, and interiors. So we talked about some castles, and I think the one today, Lilas will cover what is going to be covered today.
Yes, a fortress. So first we have the Marienberg Fortress, which we'll be talking about. And it's actually not included in our count of the 20 to 25,000 castles in Germany. But I feel like we can't talk about Würzburg without talking about the Marienberg Fortress. As you'll see, it really set the foundation for the Würzburg Palace residence, which is included in the count and is recognized by the UNESCO World Heritage Site as a beautiful look into Baroque architecture.
Yes, and now switch to the historical background. Let's open our journey at the mighty Marienburg Fortress, a place where history stretches back over 3 millennia. Around 1000 BC, long before towers rose here, the Urnfield culture carved out a Celtic refugee castle. And this wasn't a home or a palace, it was a stronghold, a last line of defense built for retreat when danger pressed too close. The Urnfield people, who thrived between 1300 and 750 BC in the late Bronze Age, left behind a haunting legacy, cremating their dead, sealing the ashes in urns, and burying them across the fields. Their fortress at Marienberg was not just a structure, but a testament to their survival. And after the Urnfield people, the Hallstatt culture rose to claim this hilltop between 1200 and 450 BC. They were a proto-Celtic society already making connections with the wider world. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of trade reaching as far as ancient Greece, and by 500 BC, Würzburg was part of a thriving wine network. So some wine.
Yes.
This hill may even have stood as a Fürstensitz, a princely seat, a symbol of power watching over the valley.
Then, around 100 AD, Würzburg's story enters into a new chapter. Over the next several centuries, the region came under the influence of different Germanic tribes, including the Suevi, Marcomanni, Alemanni, and the Burgundians. Each group left its mark on the area, shaping the cultural and political landscape of Lower Franconia. By the 6th century AD, the area had already come under the rule of the Franks. Würzburg even became, from time to time, the seat of the Franconian Thuringian dukes under the rule of the Merovingians.
And the Merovingians ruled the Franks from the 5th century until 751 AD, and they were famously known as the long-haired kings, their long hair setting them apart from the Franks. And the hair wasn't just a style choice, no. It also signified royal authority. And when you picture Würzburg during this era, imagine a patchwork of tribes, shifting rulers, and eventually the rise of a dynasty whose kings were crowned with their hair.
The late 7th century brought a story of faith, defiance, and blood. From Ireland came St. Kilian and his two companions, St. Colman and St. Totnan. Missionaries determined to bring Christianity to the pagan lands of the Frankish Empire. At first, Duke Gosbert of Würzburg welcomed them, but this peace did not last. Kilian did not approve of the duke's marriage to Galena, his brother's widow. Angered by this, Galena sought retribution. Some accounts claim it was she who ordered Kilian's death. In 689 AD, the blow fell. Kilian and his companions were seized in their beds and beheaded by Gosbert's men. In time, all three were venerated as saints. A statue of Kilian was raised in the 1730s and still stands today on the Alta Mainbrücke. And each year on St. Kilian's Day, and I found this very interesting, their skulls are carried in a procession through the city streets.
Yeah, it was St. Kilian's evangelizing that set the groundwork for what happened next. In the 8th century, Duke Hedon II raised a chapel upon the hill, dedicating it to the Virgin Mary. Yet the sacred Christian site may have stood upon far older ground. The hill was likely once consecrated by pagans to the mother goddess, a place of ancient devotion. And that legacy of faith and transformation gave the hill and the fortress that will rise upon it the name Marienberg, or Mary's Mound.
And we are now in the 8th century. In 719, St. Boniface came to Franconia. At this time, there's no longer a duke at Würzburg, and St. Boniface finds that some of the local clergy are practicing pagan customs, which he was not thrilled about. So in 741, Boniface appoints St. Berchard as the first bishop of Würzburg. Over the next 2 decades, the town of Würzburg grew, and the hilltop church lost the role of cathedral to what would become the predecessor of the Würzburg Cathedral.
and the 13th century marked a turning point. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg abandoned their old residence and claimed the commanding heights of Marienburg. And for the first time, fortifications were constructed on the hill. Around 1200, Bishop Konrad von Querfurt ordered medieval defenses to rise from the stone. St. Mary's was transformed into the court chapel of the sea, and together with Bishop Hermann von Lobdeburg, Konrad built the mighty Bergfried, a keep used for defense, and first palace or the Great Hall. These palace structures, born in the Romanesque age, were symbols of power and prestige, and by 1242, de Bourg had taken shelter here. 11 years later, in 1253, he moved in for good, and the people were restless and growing increasingly angry with the bishop and their rule. From then until the 18th century, Lobdeburg's successors remained entrenched at Marienberg, with the fortress always under the guard of armed men. And the fortress grew stronger. In 1308, Bishop Andreas von Gundelfingen expanded the palace, funded not by the church, but by the townspeople themselves, forced to pay as penance for a rite earlier that year. A well was dug on astonishing 100 meters into the earth, ensuring water even in siege. And under Bishop Otto II von Wolfskehl, yet another ring of fortification encircled the hill, sealing Marienberg's reputation as an unyielding stronghold.
Mm-hmm. And the tensions that had simmered for decades finally erupted into open conflict. Bishops had fortified Marienburg over the years in preparation for unrest. And good thing for them that they did this, because in 1373, that unrest exploded. For the first time in Würzburg's history, guns were fired in battle.
Wow.
The burghers of Würzburg Municipal Residence, bound by city law, the medieval mercantile class, who were often compared to the bourgeois, marched against the fortress. Catapults hurled stones at the hilltop stronghold, while the defenders answered with the thunder of black powder weapons. But why did the burghers rise up? The people had grown tired of the episcopal rule, taxation, jurisdiction, and the bishop's ever-tightening grip pushed them to the breaking point. To the burgher militia and their allies, Marienburg was a symbol of episcopal dominance, and so they set their sights on tearing it down. Yet the odds were against them. They were poorly equipped and unable to sustain a long siege, and they were hopelessly outmatched in weaponry, and their assault failed, and the fortress stood firm.
So you see, up until now, we're not even covered like the 1500s. And
Yes.
there's so much history, so much about Würzburg.
Mm-hmm.
So guys, you just have to be patient because we're going to keep talking about it. And in the first half of the 15th century, there was a decline of the Hochstift, or the Prince-Bishop rule, and construction was mostly stopped until 1466 with Bishop Rudolf von Scherenberg. And he added more fortifications and Scherenberg Tor, a historical building located near the Marienberg Fortress. And in 1495, Bishop Lorenz von Bibra had the fortress rebuilt as a Renaissance residence. This was a revival of elements from ancient Greece and Rome.
And we are now into the 16th century. The year is 1525, and the German Peasants' War, the Deutscher Bauernkrieg, has reached Würzburg. This was Europe's largest uprising until the French Revolution, but it ended in catastrophe. Somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 peasants and farmers were slaughtered. It kind of seemed doomed from the start. The rebels were democratic in spirit, but they lacked strong leadership. They were poorly armed, and most had no military training. Meanwhile, they faced professional armies with disciplined soldiers. And we won't linger too long here because we still have so much to cover about Marienburg and the Würzburg residents. But it's important to note that the Peasants' War was also tied to Martin Luther, who condemned the uprising. And if you'd like to dive deeper in that, I'll link a video in the sources and recommended viewing. So how does all of this tie into Würzburg and the Marienberg Fortress? In May 1525, the city was effectively forced into the uprising by the Franconia knight Florian Geyer von Giebelstadt. and his men who stormed a city council meeting. So they stormed the city council meeting and they kind of pushed the people into this. So the rebels fired on Marienberg Fortress and the bishop's troops fired back, though the bishop himself was away in Heidelberg, meeting with the Swabian League. And by June, the rebellion had collapsed. The Swabian League crushed the peasants at the Battle of Ingolstadt, just outside Würzburg's gates. And there's even a connection to Rotenburg ob der Tauber, as Florian Geyer sought heavier artillery from them to try to breach the fortress walls.
That is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And we should mention, even briefly, Götz von Berlichingen, better known as the Iron Hand. He was a Franconian imperial knight who helped lead the attack on Marienberg. His nickname came from his prosthetic iron hand, a remarkable device for the time. Götz was no stranger to conflict. His own writings describe nearly 5 decades of wars and personal battles. But for the peasants, he was disappointing ally. He wasn't truly committed to their cause, disliked the scale of bloodshed, and proved ineffective as a leader. And eventually he defected, retreating to his castle to wait out of the conflict. We will revisit him later when we reach Baden-Württemberg and Hornberg Castle, so...
Yes. And of note, he is who we can thank for the term kiss my ass.
Or in German, mich am Arsch lecken.
I thought that was really interesting that that phrase dates back so far. I would have had no idea.
I did not know that. And it's so funny because
Yes.
this is like a common term in Germany. Thank you,
Yes.
Mister.
So interesting, like, to learn where these phrases have come from and to kind of stumble upon it randomly while researching the history of Würzburg.
Nice.
Okay, and so the Marienberg Fortress had proved its purpose and it persevered. In 1573, Bishop Julius Ector von Mispelbrunn took office, and once again, the fortress was reshaped. A fire the year before had left it scarred, but Julius rebuilt and expanded the fortifications, transforming Marienberg into a Renaissance residence. Disaster struck again in 1600 when another fire tore through the north wing of the main building, damaging towers and chapels alike, and by 1607, the northern section had risen anew. The original vision was ambitious for a grand rectangular palace with 4 wings and towers at each corner, which was the fashionable design of the age, but the plan was never fully realized and the 4th tower was left unfinished.
So we touched on the 30 Years' War back in our Rotenburg ob der Tauber episode, and now the same conflict arrives in Würzburg. I think we talked about it in the episode as well. We mentioned Würzburg. In 1631, King Gustav II Adolf stormed Marienberg Fortress, and the fortress fell, and the victors plundered its treasures, most famously the renowned library, which was carried off to Uppsala in Sweden. And for 4 years, Würzburg remained under Swedish control and the allies. Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar was even appointed Duke of Franconia during this occupation, but in 1635 the tide shifted and Bishop Franz von Hatzfeld returned to Würzburg, reclaiming his seat and restoring Catholic authority to the city.
So there were no great wine drinking feats here, but life in Würzburg continued on. In 1708, the palace and church were redesigned in the Baroque style, and in 1712, Charles VI, who we very briefly mentioned in our episode of Hohenschwangau, see, there are so many connections, visited the Prince Bishop, and this would be the last time that a Holy Roman Emperor would visit the fortress. In 1719 or 1720, the other side of the Main River, which would be replaced by the Würzburg Residence, Marienberg was now solely a military structure.
Yes. When we talk about Hohenschwangau in our 3rd episode, we talked about how castles in southern Germany along the border became a casualty of war. But here we have Marienberg Fortress being actively used in several major conflicts. In 1796, during the War of the First Coalition, the fortress was stocked and handed over as a French garrison. This war had erupted after the French Revolution, when monarchies across Europe feared the spread of revolutionary ideals. And France declared war on Austria in 1792, and soon the fighting spread across the continent. Würzburg became a battleground. Archduke Charles of Austria and General Jourdan's French army each commanded around 30,000 men. The French attacked but were repelled, and the defeat at Würzburg crushed French hopes of securing Franconia and southern Germany. So Marienburg's story did not end there. In 1800, during the War of the Second Coalition, the fortress was successfully defended against another French assault by Imperial General Del Aglio. By 1803, troops of the Electorate of Bavaria occupied Marienburg, and from 1805 to 1814, it served as a fortress for the Grand Duchy of Würzburg, part of Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine. And Napoleon himself visited Marienburg multiple times in 1806, 1812, and twice in 1813, a reminder of how this fortress stood at the crossroads of Europeans' power struggles. Really
And
interesting.
it
Wow.
is. And it is so interesting to me because with some of the other ones that we've talked about, these castles have stood for centuries, but Marienburg was active from the beginning, like up until right now we're in the 1800s, and it's going to continue. So it
Crazy.
is. Yes. I mean, we've had emperors. We've now had Napoleon. It's just fascinating. And so in 1814, Marienburg passed to the Kingdom of Bavaria, known as the Königreich Bayern. This kingdom lasted from 1806 until 1819 under the Wittelsbach dynasty, from Maximilian I Joseph to Ludwig II and beyond. So the people that we have talked about.
That's so
Um,
crazy.
It is. And so during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks' War, this was a short but decisive conflict between Prussia and Austria, ending with Prussian victory. The fortress was bombarded by Prussian forces, and just a year later in 1867, Marienburg lost its official status as a fortress. It continued to serve military purposes, acting as a garrison and prison camp during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. And this was a conflict between France and the coalition of German states led by Prussia. It ended with German victory. But by 1900, with disuse and neglect, the fortress had fallen into disrepair. And in World War I, so from 1914 to 1918, Marienburg was used as barracks and for artillery. And following the war, during the German Revolution of 1918, and the German Revolution of 1918 was an upheaval that ended the German Empire and forced Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate, leading to the creation of the Weimar Republic. And it began in the final weeks of World War I. The revolutionaries seized the fortress, though government troops soon reclaimed it. And in the years that followed, the state police converted Marienburg into emergency housing, creating about 100 apartments within its walls. And then in 1935, so things are just continuing to happen.
Crazy.
In 1935, ownership passed to the Bavarian Administration of State-Owned Palaces, Gardens, and Lakes, which began the restoration efforts. And on March 16th, 1945, during World War II, incendiary bombs caused a fire that destroyed a very significant part of the fortress. Reconstruction began after 1950, and it was a long process that continued for decades. Finally, in 1990, the restoration was completed. Marienberg Fortress stood once again preserved as a historical monument.
Oh my God.
I know.
That's so much history of the
We
Marienberg Fortress.
we have stretched from like BC all the way up to 1990 and the present day.
Yes, that is crazy. And what happened? Like, they carried around those skulls. This is
Mhm.
crazy. Walking around
Yes.
them through the city, and the murders of St. Kilian, like combined with that, the German Peasant Revolt, which happened, then all the
Mhm.
French stuff that Napoleon visits
Napoleon. Yes.
Würzburg, not just once.
Crazy.
And then all the rebuilding. How
Hmm.
fun. Like, yeah. And then the Kingdom of Bavaria, which is like undertaking the Würzburg castle. And I don't know, it's crazy. Marienberg
Yes.
Fortress is just full of history.
It really is. And how crazy is it that you can still see it to this day? Something that has been filled with so much history. It still
Yes.
stands. I think
Amazing.
that is one of my favorite things about visiting Germany is seeing these places that have stood for so long.
Yeah,
It is
that's
amazing.
amazing.
And so now just moving on to a quick overview of the architecture of the fortress. So they are Renaissance features constructed in the 1600s and then the Baroque expansion in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as we talked about, much of the fortress had to be restored due to the damage done. And now for a true architectural marvel, let's talk about the Würzburg Residence.
I remember arriving and we were like astonished by how the look of this was. It was just rising. We were not expecting such a huge residence. It was crazy.
Because it's literally like, I mean, in the streets of Würzburg.
It is.
Yes,
So,
like the city is close to the city. Is it in the
yes,
city center? It's
basically in the city center. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Because
we were just walking distance from the city center.
yes, because I feel like Hohenschwangau and Neuschwanstein, they kind of like rise up on the sides of the village of
Yeah.
Hohenschwangau, and then um Nymphenburg, it's close to
It's
the Munich
special.
city center, but
Yes,
it's
but
like a
it's
little bit
apart. Yeah.
set apart. And this was like, it was right there.
Yeah. It was so beautiful.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Würzburg residence stands today as one of the most magnificent achievements of the Baroque architecture in Europe, and I can definitely understand that. Um, Before its construction, the prince bishops had already moved from the Marienburg Fortress into a smaller palace within the city, but for Prince Bishop Johann Philipp Franz von Schönborn, this was far too modest. In 1719, fortune struck, and he secured 600,000 florins through a court case, a staggering sum of the time that gave him the means to dream on a monumental scale. Determined to rival the splendor of Versailles and the grandeur of Schönbrunn, he uses his newfound fortune for the creation of a new residence. The project would eventually cost 1.5 million florins, an extraordinary figure, especially considering that one florin represented about a week's wage for a day laborer. And now he did not fund this alone. Johann Philipp Franz was not alone in his ambition. His uncle, Lothar Franz von Schönborn, Archbishop and Elector of Mainz, and his brother Friedrich Karl von Schönborn, Imperial Vice
Chancellor.
in Vienna, provided crucial financial and political support. And together, the Schönborn dynasty ensured that Würzburg would be transformed into a stage for Baroque magnificence.
Yes. And so we are going to go through this timeline because, again, a lot happened. So
What?
in 1719, Johann Philipp Franz von Schönborn
Schönborn, yeah.
Schönborn ascends as Prince Bishop of Würzburg. He wins the 600,000 florins in a court case, giving him the fortune to begin the construction. And he commissioned the Würzburg residence to rival Versailles and Schönbrunn, as Lara talked about. And his authoritarian taxation made him unpopular, but his ambition set the project in motion. And in 1724, we had the death of Johann Philipp Franz. His reign was short. It was only 5 years. We'll talk about this later. But he left behind the vision and foundation for the residence. In 1729 to 1746, Friedrich Karl von Schornburn.
Yes.
This name is very hard for me, so I
Yeah.
apologize. Brother of Johann Philipp Franz, becomes the Prince Bishop of Würzburg and Bamberg. He also served as Imperial Vice Chancellor in Vienna, giving him immense clout. He oversaw the decoration of the Southern Imperial Apartments from 1740 to 1744 and Northern Imperial Apartments from 1743 to 1745. and he was a patron of Giambattista Tiepolo and Antonio Bossi, ensuring the residence became a showcase of Baroque and Rococo art. And we will talk more about them in just a little bit when we talk about the amazing architecture. And from 1749 to 1754, we have Prince Bishop Karl Philipp von Greifenklau.
Greifenklau, yeah.
Greifenklau commissioned Tiepolo's monumental frescoes, including the grand staircase ceiling from 1752 to 1753, and his portrait appears in the fresco itself, symbolizing his role as a patron. In the 1770s, there is some later Schönbrunn influence. Stucco master Antonio Bossi adds the cherubs and seasonal motifs under the Schönbrunn patronage. The residence continues to evolve as a dynastic showpiece. In 1803, we have secularization. The Prince Bishops of Würzburg is dissolved. During Napoleonic reforms, Würzburg passes into Bavarian state ownership, ending centuries of ecclesiastical rule. And then here we are back to World War II. So March 16th, 1945, the same one that destroyed Marienberg. A British air raid devastates the residence, is gutted by fire, with only the central halls surviving. This includes the vestibule, garden hall, staircase, the White Hall, and Imperial Hall. And like Marienberg, it destroyed much of the residence. It was almost completely burnt out. And if you look up pictures of this, it was like, you can see that it was just all rubble at that point.
Crazy.
And from 1945 to 1987, we had reconstruction. And this begins immediately after World War II ended. And we'll talk more in depth about some of the reconstruction, again, when we talk about architecture. And the mirror cabinet is reconstructed between 1979 and 1987, which was a huge part of it. And in 1981, they gained UNESCO recognition. The Würzburg Residence, Court Gardens, and Residence Square are inscribed as a World Heritage Site, honoring the vision of the Prince Bishops and the artistry they patronized. And we have spent so much time on the history, but now let's step inside the architecture itself, because this is where the Würzburg Residence shows its magnificence. It's no accident that UNESCO calls it one of the most exquisite Baroque palaces in the world. If you don't get a chance to visit in person, definitely check out the pictures on their website or some of the walkthrough videos that you can find on YouTube. And we'll include some of those links in our sources and recommended reading. And the Würzburg Residence was designed by the court architect Balthasar Neumann, who's relatively unknown at the time, and the residence became his masterpiece. Neumann collaborated with some of Europe's leading minds, such as Lucas von Hildebrandt and Maximilian von Welsch from Germany, and Robert Descartes and
German
Beaufrand from France. Behind them stood the powerful Counts of Schönbrunn, whose wealth and political influence made this ambitious project possible. And what strikes you immediately are the twisting pillars, the vaulted ceilings, the frescoes, and the paintings, and the sheer scale of the statues and sculptures. And we will get into them, but the grand staircase is a pinnacle of Baroque engineering with its unsupported vaulted ceiling. The Imperial Hall glows with frescoes, stucco, and marble. The chapel blends Baroque and Rococo artistry, and the White Hall is adorned with the stucco designs of Antonio Bossi. Imagine golden candelabras casting light across the stucco, cherubs representing the four seasons.
Yeah, and then there's the largest ceiling fresco in the world, right above the grand staircase, measuring 190 by 30.5 meters. And it was painted by Venetian Rococo master Giambattista Tiepolo, which you were talking about, between 1752 and 1753. And this breathtaking fresco depicts Apollo and the four continents. Apollo, the sun god, rises at the center, which is lyre and torque, while cherubs prepared his chariot. Around him swirl allegories of the planets Venus, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, and Diana. And at the edges, the continents come alive. America, a native woman seated on an alligator, surrounded by figures preparing food. Then Africa, a woman on a camel in a bustling marketplace, merchants offering textiles and incenses. Asia, a regal woman atop on an elephant, surrounded by symbols of science, monarchy, and the written word. And then, last but not least, Europe, enthroned beside a white bull, surrounded by the arts, with a portrait of the fresco's commissioner, Prince Bishop Karl Philipp von Greifenklau.
Mhm. And the Imperial Hall is another jewel. Newman's architecture frames Tiepolo's frescoes, embossy stucco. 20 half columns rise nearly 9 meters high, glowing in reddish stucco marble beneath a vast oval dome. Tiepolo's 3 ceiling frescoes, painted in 1751 and 1752, narrate the political history of Würzburg's episcopal principality. Bossi added 4 life-size stucco figures, Neptune, Juno, Flora, and Apollo, while chandeliers and gilding complete the spectacle. And then the mirror cabinet. Located in the Southern Imperial Apartments, this room is unlike anything else in Germany. It was completed between 1740 and 1745 under Prince Bishop Friedrich Karl von Schönbrunn. It was destroyed in World War II, but painstakingly recreated in 1979. To 1987 using fragments, like original fragments, photographs, and watercolors. And unlike the mirrored halls of Nymphenburg, Würzburg's cabinet is made entirely of glass panels, and paintings were applied directly onto recessed mirror surfaces or engraved into gold grounds backed with dark gloss paint. And figures and scenes shimmer within the mirrors themselves, surrounded by chandeliers and gilded ornamentation. It is a pure Baroque fantasy. And if you so choose, check out the pictures that they have online of it, because I was blown away by what this looks like.
It was crazy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the northern and southern imperial apartments also deserve mention. These suites were crucial because imperials often stayed here en route to Frankfurt for coronations. And the southern apartments were decorated between 1740 and 44, while the northern apartments were completed in 1745, just in time for Imperial Franz I to lodge there. And after World War II, much of the stucco had to be recreated, but original paintings above the doors and fragments of decoration survived, as you said. And the restoration work ensures that visitors today can still experience the grandeur intended by the Schönborn dynasty.
And now for some of the interesting facts, the drama, and the intrigue. The Würzburg Residence. So we have some power struggles and ambition. So starting off with an interesting fact about the Schönborn family. They can be tracked back to the Rheingau region in 1275. So once again, we have a very old family, and we will be talking more about them in the future. Got lots of connections. So Johann Philipp Franz von Schönborn, his court case victory of the 600,000 florins gave him the means to start the residence, but his authoritarian taxation policies made him deeply unpopular, which we talked about. And his short reign ended abruptly. And so, because he was maybe not the most well-liked, some contemporaries whispered that his sudden death was very convenient. And it was ultimately ruled to be natural causes. But there were people who suspected that he had actually been murdered.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And we have some family politics. And so the Schönborn dynasty used the residence as a stage to project their power. His uncle Lothar Franz, Archbishop of Mainz, and his brother Friedrich Karl, Imperial Vice Chancellor in Vienna, were instrumental in securing funds and influence. And the palace was as much a dynastic statement as it was a bishop's home. And so the question surrounding this was, you have 2 very influential people in the church, and they used very significant funds. And some people were kind of wondering, like, where exactly were these funds coming from? and were they maybe using funds that were supposed to be allocated elsewhere? And so while there is not a definitive answer, that is just the question that some people had at the time. And we also had artistic rivalries. And so Giambattista Tiepolo, his frescoes became the crowning glory of the residence, but there was some tension. The Venetian Rococo style was daringly light and playful compared to the German Baroque. And so some conservative voices in Würzburg thought that his pastel allegories were a little too frivolous for the princely court. And some financial intrigue. So I touched on this, but the residence cost 1.5 million florins, which was an astronomical sum at the time and would still be today. And considering 1 florin equaled a week's wage for labor, rumors swirled that the Schönbrunns, as I said, were using church revenues for personal prestige rather than their spiritual duty. And the sheer extravagance of gold, stucco, chandeliers, mirror cabinets was seen by some as scandalous and excessive for men of the cloth. And we have some destruction and survival. So as we talked about, the British air raid that reduced Würzburg, the Würzburg Residence, in Marienberg Fortress, to ruin. The residence was gutted, its frescoes blackened, its stuccos shattered. The devastation was so complete that many thought that it could not be rebuilt. And reconstruction intrigue. So post-war debates raged. Should the residence be restored to its former glory or left as a ruin to symbolize wartime destruction? And ultimately, painstaking reconstruction prevailed, but not without controversy over the authenticity and the cost, which was 20 million euros.
The story of Würzburg is written in stone with the Marienberg Fortress and Würzburg Residence standing as bookends of its history. The Marienberg Fortress, perched high above the city, speaks of medieval power, defense, and centuries of prince-bishops ruling from its walls. It is a symbol of resilience, scared by sieges and wars, yet still commanding the skyline. And the Würzburg Residence, by contrast, embodies ambition, artistry, and Baroque magnificence. Conceived to rival Versailles and Schönbrunn, it dazzles with frescoes, stucco, and gilded halls. Though nearly destroyed in 1945, it rose again through decades of restoration, earning its place as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I think that's really important because it's really stunning. And yeah, together, fortress and palace tell the full saga of Würzburg, from medieval stronghold to Baroque splendor, from devastation to rebirth. To walk their halls and ramparts today is to step into a living chronicle of ambition, faith, destruction, and resilience. And it's a reminder that history not only preserved, but consciously reborn, which is, yeah, just amazing.
Yes.
And is there, the most important question, is there coffee and cake? There is a cafe at the Würzburg Residence where you can have coffee. It's either inside or outside. You can do both. We sat outside and it was really nice. Yeah.
Yes, and we did not have cake, but we did have some great food. It was really good. And we had coffee, and then it was so close to the city center. Like, we also walked down and got some really amazing ice cream.
The ice cream
And
was
yes,
amazing. It was
ice
just
cream
to
was
die for.
amazing. And it was like right there.
It was
Everything was
right
kind of
there.
like right there. Yes. And so this episode was very history and fact heavy, but it just shows how old these places are and how history has been preserved through time, because the fact that we can even read about this and in such great detail, that it has been documented so well and that we can still read about it today.
That's just
And tell
amazing.
you guys, yes, it's amazing.
And next time we will be talking about Quedlinburg. We will do a big jump across Germany. It's because we went up to the north on our trip and visited Quedlinburg, and we will be talking about all the mysteries and the myths and legends about that little castle up on the hill. Stay tuned, and thank you for listening. It was
Thank
just
you.
amazing. So many facts. It was a big episode. but we did not know how to cut out stuff because everything seemed to be so important for understanding how this all
Hmm.
evolved through over time. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys.
Yes. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.